over to Dr. Greg Fry.
Thanks, JB. First of all, how many of you are familiar with Virginia State University? Probably this side stay a little more than yesterday. We were over in the valley, and so that's good. We are the 1890 land grant in Virginia, located in Petersburg, not too far away from here. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a forest economist, so all the foresters in the room are rolling their eyes right now because they're having nightmares going back to forestry school and having to stare at spreadsheets and calculate net present value and stuff like that. Well, yes, that is one of the things that forest economists do, and I took the liberty of putting some spreadsheets and lots of Excel stuff in your binders there. I think we may have been a little bit short of some of the things I printed up. I think I got the wrong message and printed 100 instead of 120 copies, so a few of you may not have it. I apologize for that. If there's anything, if my presentation's not in there or anything else, you can just send me an email. I'll be happy to send it to you. I think we're also going to try to post a lot of this stuff up on the website, so you can download it later. But I do feel like I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because talking about finances and money because, well, I don't deal with forage every day or animals, and a lot of you guys do. I do, know a little bit more about the forestry side, but on the flip side of it, you guys do deal with money every day, whether it's your personal finances or managing an account at work or working with finances for a client that you work with. So you guys may know a lot more about some of these things than I do. So the approach that I wanted to take is not to necessarily throw a bunch of dollar figures and numbers at you, but really give you an idea of what would make silvopasture a little bit different in a financial or economic sense than maybe some of the other agricultural or forestry systems that you all would work with on a day-to-day basis. Okay, some of the considerations you might take when thinking about, is this going to be a profitable, good system for the landowner that I'm working with? So I'm going to give you guys a couple of spoilers here up front. Just go ahead and throw some questions out there and answer them, and then we can talk a little bit about why. But the first question is, is silvopasture unusual? Then is it potentially profitable? Is there any way people can make money doing this? Is it beneficial for everybody? And is it, and then kind of what I see as kind of the real question, if we're all forestry and forage, pasture land, and animal specialists here in this room, the silvopasture have higher returns than those practices that might be competing or alternative to it. So here's my spoiler. Is silvopasture unusual? Yes, there's a lot of what sets it apart from what we typically do on our day-to-day basis. For one, how many people would say that, how many foresters do we have in the room? Okay, so maybe 10 or 12. How many forage or pasture land, grazing land specialists do we have in the room? A few. How many silvopasture specialists do we have in the room? None, right? Well, that's because it's kind of this odd combination of them. Maybe it's not so odd. Maybe it's just the way that our society is structured that makes it seem odd. But it's kind of combining two or three areas of things that we don't necessarily think of being combined usually. It's kind of unusual in that sense. There's nobody who's going to go out and claim to be the the expert on all things silvopasture, because you have to have a lot of knowledge and skills in several different areas. That's almost impossible for any one person to have. That's why I think in order to make this work, we kind of have to work in teams. Okay, so let's, anyway, just going back, is it potentially profitable? I'll tell you why. And we'll get into that. So here's some of the things we need to think about when we're thinking about investment costs for silvopasture. Well, the first thing is, the first part of profitability is how much money you have to spend up front, right? The first problem is, you know, each silvopasture may come from a different starting condition. And these starting conditions imply vastly different upfront establishment costs. And these vastly different upfront establishment costs imply vastly different rates of return, net present value, any type of financial indicator that you want to use to demonstrate profitability will be vastly different because of those year zero costs that you have to spend. And I actually put in, most of you should have some spreadsheets that are basically cost estimates for establishment of silvopasture. These come from Delaware, from the NRCS in Delaware. And they're basically two different scenarios. One is a scenario where you're establishing trees into an existing pasture. And the other scenario, I can't quite remember what that scenario is off the top of my head. It is, let's see. This scenario is a non-commercial thinning of an existing stand of trees followed by establishment of native grasses. Okay? One of these, the establishing trees in a pasture, has cost about $111 per acre. The non-commercial thinning of trees followed by establishment of pasture is over $700 per acre. Okay? So this is more than a six-fold difference in costs. So anything we say about the profitability, potential value of silvopasture has to be tempered by that. You know, how much money do you need to spend to get this thing established? Okay? This is what you need to be thinking about if you're talking to a landowner about this. Well, what's there on the land right now? You know, what needs to be done to get a silvopasture established there? So here's some other conditions. Well, opportunity costs. Well, in the case of a thinning forested stand and planting pasture, it may only take you a year or even less than a year to get that grass established, and then you can start putting livestock out there to graze it. In the case of planting trees into a pasture, yes, the actual dollar cost of capital is lower, but you have some hidden costs there. There is time, and time is money. Time is an opportunity that's not utilized. You may need to set that pasture aside and not graze it for 3, 4, 5 years until those trees become established. So that right there is a cost. That's kind of a hidden cost. It's not in that spreadsheet I gave you. Probably should be, because that's a lost income opportunity for those farmers, right? So all these things need to be taken into account. Can the farmer afford to lose that acreage if he's got a pasture and he's planting trees out there? Can that farmer afford to lose that acreage for 3, 4, 5 years? If not, maybe you try to find some alternatives that may be higher cost on the capital end but lower cost on the opportunity cost end, such as maybe just fencing out those rows of trees and leaving the space between the rows of trees open to grazing. If you can do that with some temporary electric fencing, that might work for a producer that wants to plant trees out there but can't afford to sacrifice the whole acreage. Okay, some of the other things you would want to consider in silvopasture investment. Well, getting water to livestock. This could be a big expense if you're going into an existing forested stand that has none of the infrastructure available for your livestock. Well, how are you going to get all of the livestock's needs out there to them where they are? And this last thing can be a big issue, stumps. This is something that can double, triple, quadruple the cost of your establishment if the landowner feels that it's necessary to remove those stumps. Well, all that depends on what that landowner's management system is. Does it involve large machinery that won't be able to maneuver around stumps? If so, then yes, they may need to pay to have those stumps chipped up, grinded up to where then you can get machinery back in there. If that's not so much of an issue, then maybe this landowner can leave the stumps out there to rot on their own, or find some alternative way that may take a little more time, or maybe slightly less effective than the equipment going in and grinding these stumps out. Here's one example I was reading about. Somebody offered this suggestion. I don't know. I'm not a specialist in this particular subject, but somebody offered this as a possibility. Well, we know pigs are good at rooting things out, right? Dig some little holes around the stumps and put some corn down in there, kind of underneath where the stump is, and just let the pigs go in. They'll go in there looking for the corn and kind of dig the stumps up. I don't know how effective that is, but it just illustrates the fact that silvopasture works differently for every producer, and every producer may have a different way of getting there. And you may be forced to think outside the box in order to lower some of these costs. It may raise different costs. There may be other costs such as time, or maybe that person's own labor. So you may lower the dollar burden, but raise the labor burden, or raise the amount of time it takes to get established. If you can think outside the box, but maybe that producer can afford time a little more than he or she can afford dollars. The next thing after investment costs would be that you'd think about would be management costs. Sid mentioned pruning and told you a little bit about it. That could be an important management cost. It's not something that in this part of the world foresters typically undertake, pruning. But in silvopasture, it can be very beneficial to get a little bit more light down on the forage. And then obviously some of these other management costs would be more typical of either forestry or pasture management, but here you're combining things at the same time. So you have to think about all these things rather than just one specific set of them. Okay, so once you got the cost, the investment, and the year-to-year management costs kind of thought through, you also have to think about, well, what are the revenues going to be? What's the return going to be? Well, I would suggest, one of the things you want to think about is, are we even going to consider selling these trees in the future? This is one potential benefit of silvopasture, is the ability to sell timber. But in certain cases, maybe the silvopasture is more oriented towards the livestock side, and maybe timber is not so much of an issue, or you're willing to forego some of the timber. And if you're just thinning out a native hardwood stand, those trees may actually reduce in value over time. And you would want to think about how is what I'm doing affecting the timber if that's an objective? But maybe that's not an objective for that particular landowner. But you also want to think about how will the trees become reestablished, because this is going to be the future of your silvopasture system. Thinking about finance and economics, am I degrading the long-term capacity of this land? So these are all things you want to take into consideration. The next thing would be the shade. How is the shade affecting my returns? Am I getting better? If it's a dairy, am I producing more milk per cow? If it's a beef type thing, am I getting greater weight gain? And the last thing I wanted to mention is the wood quality aspect. There is potential that silvopasture if it's well managed and oriented towards timber, can increase the quality of the trees for selling for timber. But you need to do a little bit of market research ahead of time. If one of the things that you want to market is, well, I've been pruning these trees, so there's a lot of wood that's clear and free of knots on the outer layers of the tree, is there somebody who's willing to pay more in your area for that wood that has fewer knots and smaller knots? Those markets may be very limited in size and scope. These might be very kind of specialty markets. I'm not so sure that your average sawmill is really looking at how much clear wood there is in that tree. So these are things that you would definitely want to think about ahead of time and investigate what are the opportunities in your area. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm planting these trees today and I'm pruning them in 5 years. When I'm harvesting them 30 years from now, are those markets still going to be around? Those are things that we can't predict, right? But you would at least want to think about, what is the possibility of being able to market this higher value wood. Okay. So I want to tell you a little bit about my experience in another part of the world where silvopasture is a lot more common than it is here. I was able to talk to a lot of producers who are actually doing it and get a handle on how much this is worth, how valuable this is to them. Let me check my time here. And so I went down to Argentina and interviewed a lot of these farmers. Here's just a sample of what it looks like. These are loblolly pine trees. This is a forage species that as far as I know, we don't have here. But as you can see, I mean, this forage is growing quite well. These trees look good. They don't have many lower branches. They've been pruned. And they are in that area, they feel like they'll be able to sell that pruned timber at a higher value than typical timber that hadn't been pruned. This is just some of the climate data. Summer's a little bit warmer, the winter's quite a bit warmer, but in the end, the growing season is longer, right? So there's some difference, but I would argue that the differences are not so great that we can't learn something from it. These are the farmers I interviewed, large, medium, and small scale. Interviewed farmers who had done silvopasture from scales down to 2.5 acres all the way up to 20,000 acres. This is just data, and the message here is this is kind of a measure of, if you will, it's a measure of profitability. It's really efficiency, but it's basically how much output you get per unit of input. And I believe John this morning was talking about land equivalency ratio and how the best you can do with livestock is this. The best you could do with forestry is this. The best you can do is 100%. But even if you take a little bit away from each of those, by adding them together, you may be able to get to higher than 100% return through silvopasture. Well, that's what we believe we saw here. Silvopasture is statistically different and higher than cattle raising on the same farm. So what we did was compare silvopasture systems to right next to them on the same farm, same soils, everything, same manager, the traditional cattle raising practices. Okay, and compare the profitability. And the same with the forestry. The forestry, there's no statistical difference between these two. That's most likely because I didn't find enough that had both silvopasture and forestry on the same farm, right? So I didn't have enough degrees of freedom. But, you know, silvopasture definitely was a more profitable enterprise for them than their traditional cattle raising practices. Here's another picture. And, oops, went too far. Let's see. Oh, I see. Yeah, very last slide. I just wanted to mention some other considerations that, again, are not necessarily straight dollars and cents, but these kind of go a little bit more towards the things that John Munsell will be talking about in just a minute. But kind of the factors that are more related to individual producers. What are their individual, so let's see, these last couple, what are their internal values? Maybe they value things differently than the market does. Maybe they have individual preferences that are not quite the same as, you know, financial dollars and cents. What are some of their constraints? Maybe they're limited by the amount of cash they have on hand to invest or the amount of time they have on hand to invest. And then one of the things I'd like to look at more is diseconomies and economies of scale. We know forestry has some economies of scale. You can't hardly get a logger to come out to look at less than 20 acres. That's because they have some economies of scale there. Silvopasture may have some of those, but then again, maybe they have some diseconomies of scale. Maybe a larger producer may feel it's absolutely necessary to remove those stumps because he has large equipment that he needs to manipulate in and among those trees. Whereas a smaller scale producer, smaller equipment, more labor intensive, less machinery, maybe they feel like they don't need to get rid of those stumps. They can let it kind of rot out on its own. That could be a diseconomy of scale that would actually favor small scale producers. We don't really know for sure, but these are some of the issues that you might think about when you're talking to producers. And then risk mitigation. Can a small portion of silvopasture help mitigate the risk in some of the other areas of their pasture or the rest of their farm? So that's basically some of the ideas and issues and concepts I wanted to share with you all. And I'd be happy to take any questions. I would feel successful in my talk if you all had lots of questions that I didn't know how to answer.
Come on, it's got to be fun.
I also apologize that I had coffee all over my shirt here. I spilled myself like 30 seconds before I was about to start talking.
We got a question right here.
Greg.
Yeah.
I didn't look through the budget, I guess, the numbers that you have, but is that all from your study in South America? Or is that kind of what you
Yes.
related to the United States?
So there's 3 pages. 2 of them are cost estimates from Delaware, from the NRCS in Delaware. And the 3rd page is basically 2 budgets. It's a front and back. The front, if you probably can't even read it, it's so small, is from Argentina. That is a real producer in Argentina that I captured their reported financial data. The backside is kind of just an off-the-wall, hypothetical, purely speculative idea about what something in Virginia might look like. And I didn't, on the Argentina one and the Virginia one, I wasn't trying to pick the best one that had the highest returns with these soils that are just crazy productive and manager that's, you know, the best manager in the world. And I was trying to replicate that with kind of the hypothetical Virginia thing. So it's more of like kind of an average type, typical.
No other questions at this time? All right. Well, thank you so much, Greg.
You're welcome.